business journalist Matthew Bishop recently spoke at the Doing Good and Doing Well conference held at IESE Barcelona. He says we're witnessing a transitional moment in history as significant for this generation as the fall of the Berlin Wall was for previous ones. The future of the global economy depends on business leaders who identify with social progress and embrace the new age that is unfolding.
I'm coming to you at a time which I believe is a transitional moment that will be fundamental for your generation. It'll be as significant as you look back on your lives as former generations look back on the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Vietnam War, the Second World War, and the Depression. This is a turning point in the global economy. It's a time when a lot of old thinking is going to be thrown out and a lot of new ideas are going to be needed, and they're needed incredibly quickly. We're already seeing the Obama administration probably having taken 95% of all the decisions that are going to matter for Obama's place in history have already been taken or are in the process of being taken now. And from a team that is completely untested by and large, and are having to make things up as they go along. So we're clearly in for an era of bigger government, and the real question about whether that's going to be smarter government or a bigger, stupider government. And those things are genuinely in play, and I guess anyone with any knowledge of history would probably bet on the latter, and so this is a real important time. But it's also going to be an extraordinarily challenging time for people in the business world. For the last 25 years or so, it's been assumed that the brightest and the best people want to go into business because that's where you can really use your creativity and ingenuity, and you can really be entrepreneurial, really change things. And that to go into government is a place where you go if you're basically interested in small politics and personal advancement and sort of not really being very effective, but actually getting that status, the historic status of politics. I think that's quite possibly changing now, and that for the next 10 years or so, there's going to be a real movement of the brightest and best into government. There's going to be an assumption that the real power in the world is not in the private sector, but is in the government sector. Now, in saying all that, I'm saying that because I think at moments of discontinuity like this, there's going to be a real need for the brightest people to actually look at what was going on before and figure out what was happening before is worth persevering with and maybe growing in this new period, and what needs to be discarded. And I think the answers to that are not at all obvious. And the people like you, who I think were thinking maybe longer term than many of the people in the private sector, many people in business school, are going to be some of the people who have the ability to answer those questions, to understand what the underlying trends that matter are, and how we can actually build a better world out of this terrible mess that we're in at the moment. And I just cannot exaggerate how perilous many aspects of the economic story that we've been telling for the last 20 years are at this moment in time, that the numbers on globalization are really disturbing. I mean, there's been a massive reduction in trade. And then you've got the GDP story. I mean, the US economy grew at an annualized rate, or shrank at an annualized rate of 6.2% in the fourth quarter of last year. Taiwan looks like it shrank at an annualized rate of 12% in the fourth quarter of last year. Already you're seeing very strong protectionist pressures coming up. I was at a talk yesterday with the chief executive of PepsiCo, Indra Nooyi, who I think is one of the most visionary managers out there at the moment, and I'll come back and talk about her in a little bit. But she basically said, all the things that she's managed to get her company to start taking seriously, like being on the leading edge of addressing obesity challenges and creating more nourishing foods rather than being part of the problem, being part of the solution. All those things are going to be under threat if this globalization story breaks down. You know, the ability to actually help people move on to better diets, the ability of governments to actually invest properly in aid, all those things are in play at the moment. And therefore, it's going to need everyone to be absolutely those that have the capacity to think and to think differently and to think with a vision for the future are going to be extremely important. And it's vital that you use every insight and connection that you have to try and think these matters through. I mean, one of the ideas, obviously, I'm going to talk a bit about is the idea that I looked at in my book, Philanthrocapitalism, which I wrote with Michael Green, which just came out a couple of months ago. Because I do think that's one of the ideas that ought to survive, ought to be a driving force of whatever private sector initiative comes out as the leading initiative in this new age, new paradigm that we're seeing unfold over the next year or two. I think philanthrocapitalism was initially misunderstood by many people as being a defense of the rich. The subtitle of the book is How the Rich Can Save the World. And it came out about a week or two after Lehman Brothers went bust. And lots of people went around to Michael and myself saying, would have been a great book 3 months ago, but you know, terrible timing. The interesting thing is that in the last month or so, there's been a real change in people's reaction as they're now seeing that it's actually a very timely book, because what it's really about is this extraordinary movement that was starting amongst a relatively small part of the business leadership and the wealthy entrepreneurial groups that have prospered so much under the old paradigm, which was about the bringing together of the head and the heart, and trying to figure out how you meld those two things together. It was about business coming together with the non-profit sector, about that combination trying to improve society both through leveraging government and through leveraging business, large companies and so forth. And the book begins with this extraordinary moment that I was fortunate to be present at in June 2006, where Warren Buffett and Bill Gates stood together on stage after Buffett had given most of his fortune to Gates to give away through his foundation. And you had this situation which I believe was unprecedented in human history, of the two richest men on the planet and probably the two most successful business people on the planet standing there pledging to give away the bulk of their wealth to help millions and millions of the poorest people on the planet. An extraordinary time, and a moment that you know, some people would say, well, that was a bubble phenomena. I don't believe that to be a bubble phenomenon. I think that was actually on deeper investigation. There is an awful lot going on where Gates and Buffett and others have become a kind of role models for a new generation of business leadership, where they want to actually do more than just make money, but they actually want to find ways to make money and also to give back, and maybe even, I mean, Gates has this concept called creative capitalism, which is still very much a work in progress, I think, in terms of what he exactly means by it, but it is very much about how do we get business to not just make money, but actually to make a difference. And we also talk about social entrepreneurship, which, you know, I think is you know, one of the great forces that will shape the new paradigm. And I think the Obama administration, which is going to in many ways decide what this new or determine what this new paradigm is like in terms of whether we do get smarter government models emerging. Obama, because his first job was as a community organizer, and then he worked for one of the big philanthrocapitalists in America in one of his earlier jobs on educational reform. He understands the potential of social entrepreneurs and of social innovation, and is about to launch a White House Office of Social Innovation, whose job is to find ways to bring the insights of social entrepreneurs and philanthrocapitalists into government. I mean, there's a lot of, so I think social entrepreneurship is going to be an enormous force. I also think that corporate citizenship amongst big companies, which has, I think, until recently, largely been a PR-driven phenomena, is now being taken very, very seriously by the best chief executives who understand that if they want to be on the right side of history, they need to be forces for good in society, not forces holding back good. And I think they are now starting to go beyond the jargon, beyond the slogan, to actually ask some tough questions. And they are tough questions. And again, you'll need to think, all of you will need to be engaged in helping people to think through what exactly it means to be a good corporate citizen. It was interesting, again, hearing Indra Nooyi. She says, you know, our slogan is performance with purpose at Pepsi now. And she talked about how the company has these three focuses. One is on nourishing society, one is on replenishing society through the environment, and a third is about cherishing your employees. And yet she was talking about that and then very quickly said, but when I say performance with purpose, I don't mean performance without profits. And so how this profit and purpose relationship gets sorted out is going to be the big challenge over the next few years. But I think that the capitalist system has been so brought into disrepute by those who didn't pursue the long term and clearly identify themselves with the long-term good of society, that the new wave of leaders really understand, the best of them really understand that they need to change the way big companies engage with society. And you know, I think governments are also going to, as they become more powerful over the next 10 years, are going to demand that of the corporate sector as well. And what I think is really one of the big challenges over the next few years is to look at what the division of labour is going to have to be in this new coming together. So there's this tremendous coming together through the head and the heart of government, all the traditional putting of business into one box, the non-profit into another box, government, charity, mainstream charity, all into different boxes. All those boxes are breaking down, and now there's this coming together, but it's all a bit confusing at the moment. And I think one of the challenges, again, is to work out what the strengths are of the different actors in this new division of labour. So one of the things we focus on in the book is the role that wealthy individuals like Bill Gates and other successful business leaders can play. What can their capital do? And we describe the role that they can play as that of to be the risk capital for social innovation. So you find that more and more social entrepreneurs with great ideas go to where the most entrepreneurial philanthrocapitalists are and get the seed money, they get some of the growth money to actually try out their ideas. And this is happening both in the business sector and, interestingly, in the government sector. And I think that's where, again, this White House Office of Social Innovation will be very interesting. Michael Bloomberg in New York is perhaps the leading model of this new form of public-private partnership where he's a businessman who became mayor of New York, who's very frustrated with the inability of government to be really innovative and entrepreneurial. And so, and he reckoned a large part of the problem is that if you have a risky idea, and risk is at the essence of entrepreneurship, if you have a risky idea, you can't really sell it to an electorate. Electorates just don't like taking risk. And therefore, he got philanthropists to fund the risky ideas of social entrepreneurs in a pilot project within New York. And if the pilot succeeds, then it can be sold to the electorate much better and scaled up. And so that model is now being adopted in Washington by the new mayor there, and in Newark and a number of other cities in the US. And I know in London they're starting to take an interest in whether there can be this new sort of private-public partnership. Can you somehow, as a social entrepreneur, harness the profit motive to really grow much faster? And microfinance has obviously been the first area where this has happened in a large way, where the philanthropists essentially experimented with all sorts of different models for doing microfinance, and then found ones that were more efficient and that could actually be done as a for-profit business. And you've seen in Mexico and a number of other countries where this has been tried, India, there's a number of for-profit microfinance institutions. They have grown much quicker than would ever be possible through non-profit methods, and have therefore been able to reach a much wider audience than has traditionally been reached through charitable methods. And there's a really fascinating conversation going on, and funds are being raised, still in the early days, to what other services for the poor can you provide more efficiently through through harnessing the profit motive, and can philanthropists and social entrepreneurs work together to really build that scalability through profit into their experiments at the start, and try and find those viable models rather than just sort of do whatever works at a small scale and not really think through stages 4 and 5 where you really go mass market. I hope many of you will be part of that conversation, because I think it does hold out a great opportunity in the future. Another issue that is very important, and that as we're defining this new paradigm, it will need a lot of intelligence applied to figuring out the answers, is what's the infrastructure for this doing well by doing good movement. And by infrastructure, I mean, if you look at the traditional business world, you have stock markets, you have accounting systems that are standardized, you have a great deal of transparency, you have professional research organizations, you have management consultants. And all of those in their different ways, although in some ways are parasitical on the system, in many ways help drive productivity and efficiency and make better use of the scarce capital that's out there. All those features are largely undeveloped in the world of doing well by doing good. The metrics for social impact, triple bottom line or whatever, are still, back in the very much in art rather than science stage. There's very little agreement. So an awful lot of work needs to go into that. It's very difficult to do much of that work because there's very little disclosure. I think if we're serious about a paradigm emerging where society really understands and debates in an informed way, what is good practice, what is doing good, we need to have those organizations and that transparency grow. And that may sound very dull work, in the same way that accounting sounds very dull. But I guess we've all learned in the last 2 years that bad accounting can create global depressions potentially. I would urge those of you that are minded to think about how you measure, how you analyze, to really get stuck into that side, because I think one of the things that the capital is so scarce in the business of doing good that it needs, that in a sense, using that capital efficiently is more important than ever in that sector. And having the proper analytical tools is absolutely crucial to that. If we are moving into an era of big government, social entrepreneurs, those who want to do well by doing good, are going to have to engage with government more than they would perhaps have had a taste for doing. And so you're going to have to engage in leveraging public opinion through engaging in mass activism, mass marketing campaigns. Bono, who we write about in the book, is obviously one of the great practitioners of that through his One campaign, Make Poverty History campaign, which was funded by Bill Gates, George Soros, and a few other wealthy philanthrocapitalists. Others are now starting to embrace that model, understand how do you influence public opinion. This is where philanthropy is particularly important, because the best celebrities really understand mass market branding and how to communicate with the public at large in a way that few other people in business do. Also, sort of the dark arts of lobbying may actually have to be something that becomes part of the business of doing well by doing good. Again, not quite as attractive in some ways as heading out to Africa and actually going to a village and making the village better, but in some ways it's going to prove to be more important if this is to be the future. Yeah, because of the change in the economy, there is an opportunity now for those who are motivated to drive dramatic change in society. This is the moment. This is the moment where all those ideas that have been tried out, that have been fermenting, now is the time to really think, how do you take those to the next level? How do you scale them up? And it was a tremendously exciting moment, and I think it was partly because they saw in Obama a political leader who did understand what this movement is about and was going to be open to partnering with that. But at the same time, tremendous fear about, would the overall political system prevent that happening? The other point was really what Indra Nooyi said in her closing comments, which was really that the reason that Pepsi, under her leadership, she feels has had to completely rethink its commitment to society is because she looks at your generation and those that are now at high school and says that there has been this fundamental change, that companies can no longer attract the best and brightest talent in the world if they don't clearly identify with social progress. And she was absolutely adamant that this is not a fly-by-night moment, this was not a bubble thing, this generation that grew up in times of economic prosperity, but this is a deep, fundamental, permanent change, and that it will be crucial for the future of the global economy that the leaders understand that generation, and that increasingly the leadership comes from that generation, and that every company that wants to be around for more than the current generation and to be a leading player in this new paradigm really taps into that. So I think that's a tremendously exciting message. And as all of you must be looking at this world and thinking, what am I going to do next? I do think that that exciting message is something you should take away with you and keep front of mind as you go about whatever things that you have ahead in the next few years.